Welcome to the Process Podcast.
From new agent to broker owner.
My name is Travis McClure. This is my co-host, Preston Guyton. Welcome to the Process Podcast. This is Travis McClure, and I have a very special guest with me, Kimberly Benoit. She is a leadership coach, consultant, and soon-to-be published author. She specializes and has an extensive background in program management, change management, crisis management, strategy development, and organizational effectiveness. Kim, welcome to the show. Introduce yourself and tell us your story.
Thank you for having me. So as you said, my name's Kim, and I am from Louisiana. So I am truly a good Cajun Southern girl. And I've been really fortunate to have a pretty amazing career. I've worked in Fortune 50 companies down to startup nonprofits, and have had the ability to really get deep into a lot of different areas of business. So from operations to strategy to how do we create great leaders so that we can implement all of this wonderful stuff. And as you introduced, I've got 24 years under my belt. So really excited to be here to kind of talk about some things and share some knowledge with your viewers.
Yeah, I thought you would be a great guest. I know you and I spoke a little bit last week, and working in the industry I work in, there's a lot of realtors and even broker owners who decide to start a company or decide to start a team. And there's always that big struggle when you move from me to we. And talk about that. So why is a leadership coach so important for somebody like that?
So leadership coaches are pretty interesting. And so I like to always start with like, what is a coach? Because I think sometimes people call themselves coaches, and that's fine. Sure. But a coach really is different from anything else in the sense that coaches are really there to be a thought and accountability partner. So I am simply there to help you think through where you are, what are you trying to accomplish, what are your roadblocks, and then what are the best next steps for you. So the difference being, if you went to a mentor would probably tell you, well, here's what I've done. Mm-hmm. Here's what you should do.
Sure.
And so what necessarily might work for me may not work well for you. So my job really is to get you to think through who you naturally are and what would fit best in your trajectory, in your journey, versus maybe try to implement what I think are the best things for you. And so when we think about somebody who's going from kind of a new leader, going from an individual contributor to a new leader, this is a wonderful opportunity to talk to somebody that there's no judgment, that there is, so it's not like going to your boss and being like, I look stupid, right? This is a person who's solely here to help you think through what your challenges are and what plans you can put in place to try to tackle them. Because a lot of times we don't want to go to people we know, or we don't want to go necessarily to the people we may not naturally think of. And so this is just a great opportunity and a great partner to help somebody move forward in a way that works best for them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, we have a business coach here at, in our companies that we run, and it's exactly that. Our business coach isn't necessarily telling us what he's done, but it's just an outside, like that 100-yard view of what you have going on, that outside perspective. And sometimes as a leader, you're emotionally involved, and it's nice to have that person who's not.
Well, and I think it's also really good to have somebody who can push you and tell you and challenge you, because that's part of what happens is sometimes when you're really close, you don't want to hurt someone's feelings. Right. And, my job is to help you be successful. And sometimes I have to challenge that what you're doing is the right thing. Absolutely. I have to challenge that, that this is the best plan. So I make you think about things from a variety of aspects and perspectives. But yeah, because that's sometimes you need somebody who speaks a little truth to power and just kind of challenges you a little bit, but does it in a very loving and professional way.
Yeah. The interesting about that, Preston and I have often talked about, like a really good coach will tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear.
Yeah.
And the other thing with that is we also believe like accountability is honestly the highest form of love anybody can show you,
Yeah. And I can honestly, I've had coaches in my career, and that's partly how I ended up down this path. I mean, I've had a tremendous history of doing professional development in corporate environments and helping other people grow and learn through actual training and mentoring. But it was once I started working with a coach myself that it all fell together in the sense that they challenged me in ways that my leader wasn't, or my peers weren't able to. And I was also able to be way more candid because, again, it's kind of a protected relationship. And so that's how I could see the value of it. And that's why I think it's so important for people, if it's something that they feel that they could use, to explore, because it really can be a differentiator in helping you kind of move beyond or move forward in areas that you might be struggling.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think last week you and I had discussed a lot about the communication challenges leaders can have. Unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so it was interesting because we were talking about particularly like the me to we. And, it was funny. Right after we had that conversation, I actually had someone say to me, they were like, I really struggle with delegation.
Yeah.
And I started laughing because that's actually a very common challenge for new leaders.
Right.
And because what they think is a delegation challenge is frequently actually a communication challenge. And so one of the things I thought we could talk about is thinking through a little bit of where a lot of new leaders, I think, tend to run into some difficulty is we have been really good at what we do. We got promoted because we're really good at what we do, or we started our own business because we're really good at doing something. And leading requires a slightly different skill set. So you are actually now hiring other people to do for you to now lead. And then when you're trying to delegate, because we've hired such smart people, because we're really good at hiring great talent, we assume everybody kind of knows what we want. So if I say, for my office space people out there, so if I say, Travis, I need the TPS report, can you get that for me? And Travis, being the amazing person, the go-getter that I know I hired, you're going to say like, yes. And you're going to rush off and go say, I will figure it out. Because that's what a lot of people do. They don't want to look stupid. They don't want to say they don't know. And so I feel like I have given you this amazing gift to do this work. You are going to try to do it for me. And probably what frequently happens is, bless your heart, Travis, you try so hard, but you miss the mark. And then I get frustrated because you didn't get me what I needed when I needed it. And so I make the decision that, I'm just going to do it myself. And so delegation's hard. And so, but what really happened is we didn't set each other up for success. I, as a leader, did not set either one of us up for success. Simply because I didn't give you, I assumed you knew more than you knew. And so it's really understanding that who you are and what you know isn't intuitive to everyone around you. So I think being a new leader, that's one of the common things is, how do we slow down a little bit, share more information, check for understanding before we then kind of move on to other things. And that's a hard thing to do when you're used to doing it yourself and you're used to things going quickly. So one of the things I would say is, and kind of what we'll talk about a little bit more about how to attack that, is some great advice that I got early on in my career, because I'm a go-getter. I have lists, I get it done, and when I was transitioning into leading, was somebody told me, you have to go slow in order to go fast. And I was like, can you explain that one to me? But it's the idea that if I slow down and ensure all my pieces are in place, then my foundation is set. Then we can go very quickly because everyone's on the same page.
Right.
But if we just try to accelerate all the time, we're leaving people behind. And then once we get to the end, it's a mess. And so that is probably one of the most common things I see, is how do we get new leaders to slow down and really kind of set that foundation a little bit in their effort to execute quickly.
So how does a leader do that? First of all, like, how do you recognize, like, okay, this is a situation I need to slow down? And then what would you say would be the next steps around that?
So if you find yourself being frustrated a lot because, well, I told them and it's not getting done, or it's not happening the way you want it to,
right,
that's a very big red flag that there's pieces missing. So if you I would just say that again, if you as a leader feel like feel very frustrated that you're not getting from your team what you need, I would pump the brakes really hard. And then I would sit down and say, okay, here, what are the things that are most important in communication? There's some key things that you always want to make sure that are there, even if you think they know.
Mhm.
So I would always make sure they conclude things like, what are you asking for them to do? Why is it important? Because sometimes that's helpful. It's usually really helpful. I would also include how to do what you're asking them to do. So for instance, that TPS report, is there something specific they need to know? Is there a login they need to have? Or are there specific systems they need to go to? How long does it take for the report to run? Because you need to give a deadline of when you need something. So when do you need what by? So again, don't make any assumptions that people should know. And then it's always coming back and asking for question for understanding, so that if people really have questions, you've opened the door for them, and not allowing them to just kind of jump in and say, hey, I have a question, ask for it, maybe probe for it a little bit. The other thing I would have them think about, so if you have those 5 elements, that should be included in any communication you have. So I'd start there. And then the next thing I would do is challenge yourself in how are you communicating the message? So everybody has a go-to thing. You and I talked about this before. We think definitely there's probably some generational difference.
Sure.
So, for instance, if you have something urgent you need to communicate to somebody, how would you do it?
Probably like something urgent, I would call because I want to make sure we talked about it and you have every understanding you need to get it done.
So for instance, I might send you a text message.
Right.
And put everything I think is in there. You might have other people who would send a text message that says, I had a leader who did this, see urgent email. So they would write me a novel and then they would text me, see urgent email. And then if I didn't respond quickly enough, then I get a phone call. So they had a very complicated communication strategy.
Yeah.
But what I would encourage people to think about is, how are you naturally communicating? And is that what the message needs? And is that what your team member needs in order to be successful? So for instance, I keep going back to our TPS report, but it's a good example because it could be anything. It could be a report. It could be a project. It could be any deliverable you're asking for. Is the first time probably needs to be a conversation, either face-to-face, a phone call. If it's super complicated process, you might even need to follow up with an email with step-by-step guidance of what needs to happen, and including those five components. But if it's something that has been done before, then that text could probably be sufficient if you know that all that information has been understood, retained, and delivered on previously. So it really comes down to not just slowing down and asking, have I put all the elements in, but am I delivering it to this person in a way that makes sense to them? And again, sets them up to deliver successfully.
Kim, what comes to mind when you said, you talked about a leader I had one in my past as well, where they would deliver every piece of information like it was urgent. And yes. I think after a while, it's like, well, if everything's important, then nothing's important, right? And I think there's some importance to kind of touch on that too. There's different levels of urgency behind communication. So how important is it to match the scenario, I guess?
Yeah. So I think, again, if you go back to the components where you as a leader are forced to sit down and say, what am I asking? Why is this important that I'm asking of this? And when is it needed realistically? Mm-hmm. If you're finding everything is urgent, then that's probably a conversation. You need to really figure out what is really the priority for your team member. Because if everything's a priority, I guarantee you're going to burn that person out so fast, and then you're going to have a big retention problem.
Right.
Because the truth is, everything's not important all the time. It may feel that way, but that's part of our job as a leader, is to actually help prioritize that.
Absolutely.
And so I would again come back to ask yourself these same 5 questions: is, what is it? Why is it important? And if you're actually having required a reprioritization, say you gave them something 2 days ago, but something else came up, help them understand that the priorities have shifted. So that they don't think they're all still like hot button, fire drills that have to go on. Help people understand what you really need from them when. And, and I also think if you're not really sure if you're doing this, and this takes a lot of courage, especially for new leaders. But what I would do is I would ask your team.
Yeah.
And do it in a way that's anonymous. Like, don't wait for like an annual engagement survey, because just don't do that. But we've done some things before in the past where, especially if you have small teams, like we actually did something that was really fun. On one team I was on where we had a box and we would ask a question and people were allowed to anonymously put answers in the box. And then the leader would, at the end of it, take it. And then the team members that participated would like randomly win like gift cards and stuff to encourage people to actually answer. But it was anonymous unless you chose to put your name on it. But the idea is they were able to get some candid feedback.
Yeah.
Timely. And say, you can ask people questions. And I think the team, they're there to be successful. They're there to support you. So I think as long as you create the environment where you're open to hearing constructive feedback.
Absolutely.
Like you've got to be able to hear that you're not doing it well and then be, again, vulnerable enough to say, okay, I have to try something different.
We do a process here. We call it start, stop, keep. So a couple times a year, we'll say, hey, what's something that, you think we should start doing? What's something we do that you absolutely hate, we should stop doing?
Yeah.
And then what's something we do now you absolutely love, you would hate it if we stopped this, so we got to keep doing it, right? And we have people fill out these surveys and we give them the same thing. Like, you can put your name on it. You can, if you don't want to, you don't have to, but just turn them in before you leave the meeting, whatever. And we have everybody fill this out, the start, stop, and keep. And it's a funny thing that I've come to realize, like, if you don't get any kind of feedback that's not good, like if everybody's just like, oh, everything's great, we're good, it's almost like a red flag to me. Like, they don't trust you enough to give you honest feedback, as a leader. I want some feedback that's not good.
Well, and I think you have to demonstrate like consistently that you're open to it. And so one, you have to ask for it consistently.
Sure.
And you have to show that when somebody gives you something, that whether you agree with it or not, you say thank you and say, you know what, I'm going to take that back and reflect on that. And you've got to create the culture where people feel open enough to do it, because if they're scared that there's going to be some kind of crazy retaliation, they'll never be honest with you.
Right.
Or that their job's in jeopardy or something like that. So we used to call it stop, start, continue.
Okay.
And so one of the things that we did too, which is always interesting if you really want to it depends on how you want to do it and what the culture is like on your team. But I've seen some team member, like I saw a leader once just have it up in a common area, like some white paper, and people would just come and random slap stickies.
Oh,
and so I've seen that done during workshops and stuff. And so that way it's like, you're free to go put it up and you just kind of give the information. But that's the important part, is like, if you ask for it, then you got to do something with it. Yes. And then the more that you show you're open and that you're going to do something about it, the more likely people will be candid with you and give you real answers.
Yeah, we do it probably like twice a year. We'll kind of do that. We do a weekly sales meeting in our company. We do that twice a year. We kind of end the meeting with that and hand out and have them turn them in before they leave. And it's like I said, it's like if we didn't get any, I don't want to call it negative feedback, but we didn't get any like corrective feedback.
Constructive.
That to me is a red flag. Constructive. There you go. Constructive feedback. That's a red flag to me, because like no company is perfect. No leader is perfect. Like, you should have somebody wanting to give you some input.
Well, I mean, fortunately, I've never had that experience. I think there's always been something that, but I mean, that's a good sign, because you should be trying things as leaders. And, right. I think growing is part of it. And so again, the analogy I gave a leader recently we were working with, she was really frustrated because she was trying something and she felt like she was failing a lot. And I said, well, what do you think would happen if every kid that was learning to walk just kind of quit after the third time and was like, you know what, I'm over this. I've fallen 3 times. I've cried a lot. Like, I'm done. And I was like, no, I mean, it's the commitment to keep figuring it out, keep trying. Know you're not going to get it right the first time.
Right.
Or even if you're lucky and you take, a couple great steps the first time, you may fall the next 4 times, and that's okay. We're human and we're trying to figure it out too. And so I think it's just being open to that, admitting that. The other thing I would say too is not necessarily waiting for to be like we were talking about, asking for the feedback. But one of the things I think is really important for leaders is if you know you didn't show up well, or if you know that you didn't put all the elements there for somebody to be successful, is coming back and owning it.
Yes.
Like proactively. And
that's a sign of really good leadership, in my opinion, when someone can do that.
Well, because one, that again, you're setting the you are setting the stage for your team. And you are like, you're creating your culture in that moment of saying, hey, I screw up. If I can come forward and say, hey, I didn't show up as my best. I'm sorry, I wasn't the leader you needed me to be in this moment.
Absolutely.
I recognize that. I promise I'll do better, that kind of thing. Then you're now creating the space for other people to do the same thing, is say, hey, I didn't show up as well as I could have on this project or this ask or whatever it is. You're creating the space for people to be human, to acknowledge it, ask for forgiveness, but also to make corrective that show that they're trying to do better and in some way moving towards a corrective posture. But yeah, that's huge, because I think you have to show you're human. You can't pretend you're perfect, because again, that team won't last very long if you do.
Right. And they won't, I think that's how you build trust, just kind of owning stuff like that. I wanted to ask you too, because you and I talked about it a little bit last week, and I think this is really hard, especially I can remember when I first got into leadership, is giving constructive feedback, like giving that candid feedback of like, hey, Kim, this didn't go the way we had hoped. You know what I mean? Like, talk about that a little bit. What advice would you give to a new leader on how to sharpen that skill?
Oh, this is again, so perfect, because I'm actually working on some training material, because this is probably one of the hardest questions, because so much of that comes down to the relationship you're building with your team. Because if you have a trusting relationship with your team member who's not showing up, that's actually an easier conversation to have than with a team member where there is no trust, right? But the elements I think that need to be really important is, one is, I think, is it shouldn't be coming out of the dark. So one, I hope that we're not just talking about like the annual review, because that should not be what's happening. Like, no one should be surprised, like, if they're having this conversation. But what I would say is, because that actually came up recently too, is, feedback and performance should be a continual process. And it should be a conversation you're having with your team member on a regular basis. And so, I think sometimes one approach that I think can be helpful, especially for new leaders that are nervous about having this conversation, is, set up a structure. So where you're asking the team member to come in and say, okay, tell me 2 things that went well. Tell me 1 thing that could have gone better, or that you would have done different. You would do differently if you could do it over.
Yeah.
And then basically come back with the same and say, okay, let me tell you 2 things that I saw that went really well. And here's 1 thing that I think I would love to see us approach differently. So definitely not using language of you suck, or, because again, like some people have, but make it more constructive, and always assume good intent, unless you have information otherwise, but always assume good intent on your employee's part, and that they want to show up and do well. And maybe like there's aspects that you weren't aware of. But by setting up that structure, you're allowing that team member to open the door of what they see about themselves. Because the truth is, we're all our own harshest critic.
Yes.
And so they may actually be focused on something that they think is an undesirable issue or a problem that from your perspective isn't that important. And so it gives you a chance to kind of come together and align on where they need development and where maybe they need to focus. And so, but again, you're opening the door so that you can have that conversation and you can get that insight into who they are. Because I think sometimes that's really important, is that you need to know how your employee sees themselves and what's important to them.
Yeah, and that's a really challenging thing for most people, is
Yeah.
having that self-awareness, especially when it's maybe an opportunity in a situation like that. What I love about those questions, and I'm taking notes. I feel like this is the second time we've met on Zoom, and I'm like learning stuff. So you asked the questions, hey, what are two things that went really well? What could we have done differently?
Yeah.
I love that because you're really leading them down that path of self-discovery.
Yeah.
Hey, what could I have done differently?
And focus it on what could you have done, like, and make it a personal ownership, because especially if it's a group project,
Yeah,
if something didn't go well, it'll be very easy to say, well, so and so,
right.
if so and so had done different. But really make it about personal, like, what would you like, what did you think did not go well, and what would you like to do differently, or if you were in that same situation today, what would you do differently to get a different outcome? So again, it puts it back on the focus of their ownership, and not necessarily other dynamics that they can't control.
It's funny as we talk about this too, my mind immediately goes to parenting, because I feel like this is a great strategy. Sometimes with kids it can be hard to give them
Yeah.
feedback they sometimes need to hear, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is a great all around tool. Um,
You're welcome. Glad to be helpful.
Kim, I always love to ask the question about a book or a recommended book, but I think it's pretty cool. You and I were talking last time. You were telling me about a book you're in the process of writing and publishing. Tell us a little bit about that.
So yeah, it's been really an interesting journey, because when we talk about leaders and self-awareness, one of the things that has come up a lot is when we talk about kind of toxic workplaces and toxic leaders, we're very quick to point the finger at someone else.
Mhm.
And I had this interesting idea of like, well, how often would somebody who's worked for you say that you're the toxic leader? And so I started asking people that, and it was interesting to see people's responses. And so kind of this idea of self-awareness is, I got this idea for this book because the reality is we all in leadership all make mistakes.
Yes.
We have all done things that in hindsight, we're like, oh God, I wish I hadn't done that. And so the question then becomes is like, are you aware of like when you're not showing up well? And then what are the triggers that sometimes can create those dynamics for you? Especially if it's something that happens repeatedly throughout your journey. And then what would you want to do differently? So how do you start putting some action into place to not fall into those traps again? So I've written a book. The title is We've All Done It. And it really is around understanding kind of the roles we all play. So whether, the joke I make, a little bit dicey joke, but it gets into the humor, because I believe we should laugh. Like, we have to be able to laugh at the goofy things we've done throughout life. But I say, whether you have dealt it, smelt it, or felt it, when there is a toxic environment, we're all aware.
Right.
And we've all played one of those roles at some point in time in our life. And so what I want us to get into and ask the questions of is, how do I show up in each of those ways? And how do I maybe want to change how I show up? Because I think as leaders, it's our job, it's our responsibility to kind of try to be the best we can be, but also understanding we're going to screw up along the way. So there's no judgment, but it really is, how do we continue to make that incremental improvement to be the leader that our teams need us to be and that we want to be? So yeah, that is coming out next year, early next year. And I can say, going through this process, it is by far one of the most humbling experiences, and I will never take for granted any book I ever read. So this has definitely been an amazing, amazing experience. But I will leave you with two books actually, that I think are great career in helping guide my leadership. Ego by Simon Wakeman, phenomenal. And Start with Why by Simon Sinek.
It's one of my favorites. Love that book.
They truly are. I mean, exactly. I mean, they're very good, especially for new leaders in trying to kind of figure out who you are, what is your style. These are great guides to figure out, okay, here's how I can approach something, but then figure out, in working with your leader, working with mentors and a coach, of how do you make it your own and make it authentically who you are, I think is really helpful.
Kim, as I said, this has been great 2 times I've been on Zoom with you. I've learned, I got a whole page full of notes just from interviewing you for a podcast, which I'm always a fan of. If somebody wanted to get a hold of you or contact you and talk to you about leadership, what's the best way for them to do that?
Go to my website, which is KimberlyJBenoit.com. And for those non-Southern folks, Benoit is spelled Benoit, but I know you'll probably include it in the show notes. And but yeah, that's the easiest way to find me there. And I'm happy to connect with anybody who has more questions or just wants to chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to We've All Done It coming out early next year.
Yep.
And I appreciate you being a guest. Guys, have a great rest of your day. Have a great week. And thank you for listening to The Process.